God is good. God is good. I feel pretty not so great today. I've been having some just conflict at the place where I work. There's a lot of things that I let go of. So I work in this big place with a lot of employees, and you know, it's the cran box of humanity. And between all the different people, different places in their lives, some that seem to care less about the job, some that are, I mean, it's every walk of life. And I could say in a healthy way, I've let go of a lot of things, a lot of rigidity about stuff. I've let stuff, in the past would kind of tick me off, or I'd feel like I needed to address. I kind of just let it go and say, you know, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Forgive us. This is just humanity. It's never going to be perfect. It's never even going to be close. In fact, it's typically going to be quite far away, and it's frustrating to hold on too tightly to one's ideals. And so I think part of that has been good for me. But I'm a very different kind of person. Not that I want to be, not that I'm particularly proud or ashamed one way or another. I just seem to be very different than a lot of people. Um, and we all, I could say, out of the other side of my mouth, we all are, and I'm no different in that sense. But my values and priorities in life they don't really match a lot of other people's. And so a lot of the exploration for me has been how much of, what I'm kind of valuing is worthwhile and true. How much of that can be relaxed. Like I'm an introverted person. Have I always been an introverted person? I'm not so sure about that. See, that's one thing I've been kind of exploring is this idea of nature, nurture, genetics versus social conditioning, etc. And I've been trying to really contend with some trepidation. With some trepidation, but trying to contend with a lot of the orthodoxies we have around, psychological understanding. And I can even say, in a controversial way, I've been, because of my involvement probably in some degree with Christianity, Catholicism, but also kind of my opening up, broadening up of my political identity, my coming out of a less fixated, coming out of a more fixated place into a more open place politically, wanting to just question and be open to listen to different perspectives, which I think is a good thing. I feel much healthier as compared to where I've been in the past on politically, ideologically, and many other things. But controversially, a big thing, especially when you start to engage with the church, is homosexuality. And, all the other crap, LGBTQ QIA, etc. And one of those orthodoxies, I don't really want this to be, maybe I'll do another video about that. I'm not sure if there's anything good to come out of talking about such radioactive topics, but maybe I'll talk about that a little bit here, maybe in another video. But, we've got these kind of cultural orthodoxies on so many different topics that we're raised with. And one of them, with homosexuality that I was raised with is that it's a fixed thing, that you're born this way is kind of the phrase a lot of us, in the past decades have been inundated with. And I have to say, I don't really know what's true there. In the past, I would have been too afraid to even question something like that because I guess I just was in such an ideologically captured place. I just wouldn't have even thought to question it. But I think it's one of those things that the church, there's so many excesses in the LGBT, we'll just say alphabet stew, in the alphabet community. There's so many things there that I just, as a younger liberal person, doing my best to toe the line, doing my best to be an observant liberal. Whenever I would find conflict within myself or friction within myself or something that just didn't feel right around many issues, but, and again, I'm going to try to move this in another direction. I'm just using this as a springboard. But, anytime I would feel some like this just doesn't feel right, something to do with, the liberal agenda, and especially with, gender, politics, sexuality, all that stuff, I had this kind of inbuilt mechanism, I guess conditioned mechanism, brainwashed you could say, ideologically motivated, that it was something wrong with me. If that couldn't possibly be intuition telling me something is off here, that it was because I was biased, small-minded, bigoted, and I needed to work on it, I guess is the way I probably would have described it. But in practicality, what that really means is just squashing your honest feelings about something, kind of repressing or just ignoring. But as I've gotten older, and especially as I've seen, there's a lot of things, just kind of the hedonism of so much of gay rights and all that stuff, the hedonism of it. There's kind of a smugness. There's a self-righteousness, I'll just say it, kind of very judgmental. It's like judgmentality dressed in a very tolerant, non-judgmental garment. But once you get close to it, you see how, it's an ideology. It's a pseudo-religion, pseudo-spirituality, and it has its orthodoxies and its blasphemy laws but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that just didn't really make sense to me at the time, but I kind of just thought, well, I'm just going to fake it till I make it, or there's something that's wrong with me and I just need to keep exposing myself to these ideas and eventually it'll feel good. But yeah, just even the term pride, that doesn't at all resonate with me. I can play the other side of it, and I know the argument, which is if you've been oppressed for so long, you have to boldly go out into the culture and say, here we are, and you're not going to oppress us, and you're not going to beat us down, you're not going to brutalize us, and we're going to go over the top almost as a counter measure, to protect the community or something like that. I don't know. As I've gotten older, I just more and more appreciate sort of the traditional spiritual values of this country and of most countries when you get down to kind of traditional norms, traditional spirituality. And it's because it protects, it's like it's a holistic, total ingredient. It's a whole recipe that's embedded in some explicit ways and in many implicit ways that are not easily teased out and are only kind of noticed after the traditional norms have been cast aside or broken apart, deconstructed, and chaos ensues. You realize how much goodness was contained, how much stability was contained in that original recipe, and in ways that we didn't even really appreciate. But even in just very hot button issues, third rail, is that the right term? Third rail issues. Around all these issues, trans debate, male, female. You just see as you start to probe into it, and if you have if you're sincerely open to investigating and hearing multiple sides of the issue, the picture stops being so neat. Again, kind of referencing back to, just to be concrete, one aspect of this idea that you're either born gay or you're born trans or you're born whatever, and you're born this way, that idea. I don't know that that's true. And my sense is it probably is not true. Shocking, bigoted thing to say, right? I don't know. Maybe there are some environmental it's hard to say. I have to be humble and say I don't know. I really don't know. But I have, definitely explored many sides of this, and there are gay people who have, gone through hell and done a lot of healing work and have come to a place where it seems like they're coming from integrity, of recognizing that a lot of their confusion around their sexuality and their gender and all this stuff was tied into trauma, tied into their upbringing, tied into, dysmorphic feelings, and that there were certain biographical features of their life that moved them in that direction, and that I think is a really important thing to recognize, because if that's the case, it shifts it recontextualizes the whole issue. Boy, this is a hard thing to talk about because there's so many issues wrapped up in here. And unless you get really specific and really down into the details, it's inevitably going to be sloppy. So forgive me, have grace on me for this. If whoever happens to hear this video, and again, let me just emphasize, I don't really know, but I'm just trying to contend with these things honestly. But it recontextualizes something like being gay or being trans, and those are two different things. There's important distinctions, but they're also not totally separate. But it could be for somebody that, rather than affirming what's going on for them, what should be happening is healing. So, and that's a huge distinction because the culture, the society is just this cascade, this avalanche of just affirm where people are at. Affirm, affirm, affirm. But if somebody's sick, and this is why it's so consequential, it's like how do we look at something like that? Because if it's something that's a wound inside of them, and it is sort of a kind of psychological coping structure, mechanism, that identity, that behavior, the identity, the feeling, uh, um, that if that is the case, that there's a wound under that, and that's sort of the personality structure that's built on top of it, then you're not really helping somebody by just affirming, you know. So these are some questions that I'm exploring, and not in a vacuum. I mean, there's a lot of people that have shared their testimonies on stuff like this. Now, I also know that there's a wisdom in, and it could be possible that someday it'll be crystal clear that it's totally genetic. You know, when you explore some of these issues, they talk about the gay gene and there's no gay gene. And so that right there is kind of an important insight, right? We haven't determined this, despite what the culture throws at us, we haven't determined that these things are genetic, or that you're born this way. That has not been scientifically proven. That just seems to be, based on what I've researched, the facts. I've also read that there's certain patterns. It could be something, is the term perinatally, when somebody's in utero, that there could be some kind of a component genetically, or that there's certain configurations within family history, you know, which order the child was born in, that there's a number of different factors that may not just be trauma related. So, and it may also be, I'm open to the possibility that it may be that for some people, it basically essentially is something that they're born with, that you do the deepest psychological work possible in a real in way, with integrity, with truth as the highest virtue, highest value, that you do that work, that they work with people of, you know, integrity, somebody in this position, a gay person, or trans is a little bit clearer to me. So I guess I'm kind of going at the more difficult subject in my mind, but that you have somebody who is gay and does deep work and, you know, depth work, unpacking their family history, unpacking their wounds, you know, going as deep as somebody can go, you know, be expected to go psychologically. And it's just not a variable. Their sexuality is just not a variable that ever alters or shifts. That, you know, there's no amount of healing or God's grace or anything like that. That it's somehow constitutional. That does seem possible to me as well. And of course, it's also psychologically really unwise and spiritually really unwise to, you got to meet people where they're at. And if you're just forcing people into shame and self-hatred and condemnation and stuff, I mean, it's wrong, but it's also just practically, I don't see how that's really ever going to be an effective approach. Seems like you heal through love, through generosity, through integrity, and a willingness to engage with what's true. That's really what matters. And I know the church's stance on that. Well, I mean, and see, that's another thing is I've engaged. It's like the Lutheran Church is one example. You've got the ELCA. You've got these different synods, these different kind of church groupings nationally, and I guess probably internationally. And one of the big schisms in the church in the past couple of decades, and why you have these more liberal branches, more traditional Orthodox branches, not just Lutheranism, but it's just one example. I think has to do, I was talking with a priest recently, pastor recently, has to do with gay marriage and, gay rights, gay issues. And then women's ordination was another big one. And so the Orthodox view, and I'll take the Catholic Church, what I understand of the Catholic doctrine on this is that homosexuality is disordered. Disordered. It's an interesting word because we have that in the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And when you say something like that, there's like a kind of a charge to it. You've got a mental disorder. Sounds pretty bad. It's not something you want to have, but when you kind of sit with that word for a second, disorder, something that is improperly ordered. It's an interesting way of framing it. Now I have to say, I don't know what's true. I'm not God. Is God, all pervasive until I'm not even clear at this point. As Christian as the walk has been for me lately, I have to say I'm not convinced of anything really. I love Jesus, I love God, but a lot of the orthodoxies, I find it myself hard pressed to really speak in a convicted way because a lot of this stuff I just can't prove. And I'm not going to go around, being a phony about what I don't know. I have my hunches, have my suspicions. I know a Christian would tell me, it doesn't matter what your opinion is, it matters what's in Scripture. I know that would be but there's something, let me not get to that quite yet. I just have to keep emphasizing my fundamental openness and humility and that I don't really know. I'm not God here, so. But it's interesting that some light is breaking into all these issues for me because I had been for so long I had been in this very kind of progressive, liberal, ideological position on a lot of these issues. And it's not so straightforward. And I think the church has served a really important role. And I would never have said this years ago. But and I should say the Orthodox Church, the more traditional conservative churches, basically, not the kind of progressive LGBTQ affirming women pastors type of churches, but, the more traditional churches have served a really important role in providing a counter argument for a lot of this stuff. And a counterbalance and a stabilizing force. Part of what's informing me is I watch a lot of these street preachers, Nicholas Bowling and Pastor David Lynch, is that his name? David Lynn. And there's been others where they go to pride events or they go into the gay neighborhoods and they just start, street corner preaching. They have a little microphone and they just start, preaching. I find those videos very interesting, very nourishing in many ways, and I really appreciate, I'm surprised in some ways, again, to be saying some of this stuff, but not because I'm 100% where those guys are with their beliefs, where Nicholas or David Lynn are, but you can just, there's like a deeper dynamic there that you see as very healthy and very good. And it really kind of holds a mirror up to all the kind of distortion and confusion. One of the sins, I think, and distortions that just has become more and more apparent to me as time has gone on within, pride events and the gay community. And forgive me for taking liberties and speaking just in broad brushstrokes here, but these videos really hold up a mirror to just how lost people are in their lusts, in their passions, in these very shallow dimensions of their being. Leaving aside the question for a moment of, God's stance on homosexuality. But for me, I can say about the holy life is it's moving away from hedonism. It's moving away from that gratification treadmill. It's moving into a deeper place within your being. And these identities, becoming so fixated and identified with and building your life around your sexuality is just gross to me. It's insane. I'm sorry to put it in such stark terms, but and again, I can make the case from the other perspective. I'm well acquainted with why historically it may be that way, and what somebody would say in response to a statement like that is that they have to be really bold and out front because otherwise they get marginalized and oppressed and things like that. But I don't know if that's really where we're at culturally now. I don't know really if there's some truth in there perhaps, and people should not be I don't even really need to say that. Of course, I don't want people to be, attacked or hurt or anything like that. Again, the alternative frame I'm exploring here is more like these are people, many of these individuals are wounded, need support, need healing. I'm not like saying, anyways, I'm not really saying anything. Right now, I'm sort of exploring, and I'll get to where I'm at with all this, but I kind of want to lay out some terrain. But when I see these street preachers at these events, and it's, I guess, they go into it knowing that it's going to be a provocative thing to do. There's an antagonism there between what the Bible says and traditional Christianity and, kind of the prevailing ethos and ambience at a pride festival. But yeah, it's, when I said a moment ago gross, I just mean it's kind of sad how much of that identity is wrapped up in something that is wrapped up in somebody's sexuality. I find that just bad. Let me see if I can be more articulate about that. It's like the hallmarks, like especially when these guys go into the lion's den or into the hornet's nest or whatever and stir up, to put it in Christian terms, it's like stirring up demons because you're kind of coming in there and you're questioning their identity, and people hold on to their identities strongly. It's not bad that one should have an identity. I think your identity ultimately needs to come from God, and then that orders everything downstream of that. I think that's part of what I'm trying to say is one of the sins of that is it's like sexuality is part of an integrated whole of one's being, but it's just and it's not unimportant, of course. It's a procreative dimension of our being, and that's important. But when we kind of fetishize it and elevate it to this over-exaggerated place of importance, of course your life's going to be totally out of whack. And it's not like, a lot of these videos, it's not like somebody coming up and just having, a thoughtful conversation with the street preacher. And the ones that I'm talking about now, yeah, they could be a little bit fiery, but they're not going in there saying fags are going to hell, excuse my language, but that's like Westboro Baptist, right? It, that's not the types of preachers that I've been paying attention to. Now they're going in there and just preaching the gospel and trying to engage and they're not backing away or shying away from the biblical message, but they're not going in there being disrespectful or unkind, but they're met with such vitriol, they're met with such rage, they're met with such violence, verbal, sometimes often physical. And the ways that these people in these events attack and harass, totally not in good faith, just very, oh man, it's frightening to watch in some ways. Let me see how I can express this. To me, what it does is it holds a mirror up to the corruption and is evil too strong of a word? Misguidedness. Lack of wholesomeness. What's a good word here? Toxicity, unhealthiness of that ethos of the Pride events. And I've seen enough of these that I feel like I have a general sense, and I've been to some, especially when I was younger. And you just, as you mature, you can kind of just, and you have more life experience, more psychological wisdom, more spiritual wisdom, you feel into that and you can just, without a whole lot of psychoanalyzing, you just see these are very confused people. These are not wholesome. This is not a wholesome way of living. This is not just, also, in some sense, these are lost people. Not permanently lost or something like that, but they're on the wrong track, to put it mildly. And it makes sense when I step back from it and I think, yeah, of course, if you're going to build an identity and community around your sexuality, of course that's going to lead to a very distorted thinking and disordered way of life. And so I appreciate, Christianity and Catholicism for to the extent that it has. It's been one of those few pushbacks in the culture, in the kind of immune system of the culture, that's said, let's not just rush off a cliff here, guys. Maybe there is something good in that recipe that traditionally has been held by religious institutions and religious belief and traditional values that for, decades, centuries, millennia has held societies together. This is a very novel thing that we're doing in the past couple of decades in the States and in the Western world. And as I survey the culture, I just see so many things just in free fall. And it's, it's hard to draw a perfectly straight line, but you can see, these kind of big seismic shifts in culture around gay marriage. What was that, 2015? And just a general tenor of how civil rights evolved into gay rights movement and all these things. And yeah, of course, when you're problematizing and undermining and deconstructing something so fundamental and basic as family values, family unit, when you're elevating sexuality over modesty, pride over humility, normality over the periphery, traditional norms. When you're problematizing that and breaking apart the center, of course it's going to lead to chaos. And man, I don't think I've expressed any of this very well, so forgive me. And I've drifted so far from the original point I was trying to make. You never know where these videos are going to go. It's interesting that for a long time, I think up until the 60s or 70s, being gay was considered a mental disorder. Freud, I think, had theories on how it was something that arose in childhood, sort of a developmental misstep in childhood. Not that I'm on board with Freud and all of his ideas, no, but I also don't totally throw them out there. I think there is some interesting and useful ideas in there, and he wasn't totally without merit, even though some things seem to me kind of crazy. But and I'm not sure we've large scale and for many people at an individual level, I'm not sure that we've moved in an enlightened direction with a lot of these issues. Again, I've said this in other videos, I think it's important to have strong traditional cultural norms to stabilize a society. That needs to be the 90% majority of the society, or 80%, I don't know. But a strong central core of traditional norms. Central social value set. Traditional value set. And there's a generativity and a largesse and a bigness there and a stability there that in its own way kind of protects and allows for the periphery. But when you break apart that traditional center, and in that vacuum, you just try to throw in every fringe, every peripheral, every marginal, identity and value, it just is, it's bad. It's entropy. It's free fall. It's chaos. It's a horror show, And there's a lot of fallout and a lot of harm that happens there. Now, is all of this God's plan? Am I 100% on board with the preachers and things like that? I'm not. I don't think I am really. First of all, I don't know. I mean, there's a commonsensical approach to a lot of this, which gets totally thrown out, and that's part of, your intuition getting overridden by the culture, which happened to me, and it's still something I'm kind of struggling to recover in certain ways, but when I was young, first heard about all this stuff. I can't even remember when I first heard about it, but it probably just didn't make sense, two guys kissing or two women. And just to be honest about it, not saying that I'm proud of this or also not ashamed of it, but just kind of the honest truth is, from a gut level, it's kind of there's like a repellent. It's kind of repulsive in the technical sense of just that doesn't feel right. Now somebody could say, well, that's because your inbuilt orientation is heterosexuality, so of course the other is going to feel out of alignment. Perhaps that's true. But I mean, even if we were to take a non-religious, a biological standpoint, we've got these bodies, and part of what they are built to do is to reproduce. And, just from the most commonsensical point of view, a man being with a woman, it just kind of makes sense, right? It's not like a complicated mathematics. And the other doesn't really make a whole lot of sense biologically to me. I've heard theories and I haven't investigated them well enough to know the good faith intentions or the empirical basis of whoever was making the arguments about homosexuality being something that occurs in nature, and that there is a kind of evolutionary biological reason for something like that. Maybe. I guess it's possible. It's also true that what the phenomenon of being gay or queer or LGBTQ in the culture nowadays, whatever that is 1,000 times removed from whatever we might point to in nature with bonobos or whatever, and same sex. But at this point, and just to disappoint everybody in this video, why not? I don't find the convincing at all to just throw a Bible verse out there and say, you know, being gay is wrong because it's in the Bible. To me, that's asserting something as axiomatically true. There's kind of what's the word? It's like self-referentially true, but it's not logically based. It's not, that's why I've tried to kind of open the playing field and talk a number of different dimensions into this issue. Again, it may be that God has this great design for us, and that homosexuality is not a part of, a fully healed, fully aligned life, fully aligned with God's will. I guess that is possible. But it wouldn't be enough just to have somebody axiomatically tell me, and again, forgive me if I'm disappointing people here, just to axiomatically quote, Romans, I don't know what the verse is, or Deuteronomy, or whatever the verses that talk about sodomy or homosexuality. That's not enough for me. What is convincing to me is I see just all the fallout and damage being done, especially on younger people. And we could move into talking about the trans debate, trans issues. And from the data, it seems super clear that there is a high correlation with mental health. Now, correlation is not causation, of course, but with, other mental health issues, dysmorphias, anxiety. We live in a very deconstructed culture, so it doesn't surprise me that more and more people are confused about all this stuff. But the trend lines of like the number of kids, and I think the majority are young women rather than young boys, but has just shot up exponentially. I think social media plays a role in all of that. And there's this contagion factor you hear people talk about. In the same way, when I was younger, bulimia seemed to have this kind of cultural contagion, social contagion aspect, where a lot of young women were getting wrapped up in the horrors of, eating disorders. And it still happens, but I don't think it's on the scale it once was. There's kind of this mass explosion, mass hysteria, mass contagion. And you see that happening with something like trans and queer and LGBT in ways that even if we were to make the biological argument, the percentages culturally driven, socially driven. So again, that again kind of undermines this born this way type of idea that there's a lot more plasticity in here. There's a lot more elasticity. There's a lot more cultural influence, and and the ways that it maps onto people who are, sometimes autistic, sometimes just other depressed, anxiety, um, somebody in the past who might have been, well, I don't need to go down that road. There's ways that it kind of maps onto and amplifies really unhealthy things in people's lives, and people get lost in these ideologies and end up mutilating their bodies and doing irreversible damage, and then later really regretting it. And when you just step back and you look at, like these pride events where these preachers go to, these preachers just seem so, especially the two that I'm mentioning, Nicholas Bowling, and they just seem so healthy and normal, even if you're not 100% on board with their beliefs. They just seem grounded, centered, like normal people going up against just very dysfunctional people. It just seems so clear. The dysfunction just seems so clear. And people hold on to that identity and that dysfunction because it's their identity. But it doesn't seem, there's just, doesn't seem to be conducive of health and integration and a grounded life. In so many cases that I've seen, seems to be springing out of, or co-arising with, there's another term here, comorbid with a lot of other just unhealthy things. And so all of that, all that darkness and stuff that I just sense and see directly and intuit, doesn't predispose me to want to celebrate or feel good about that stuff. Are there people out there that, for whom it's much more balanced, healthy? Yeah, I do think that's possible, and I'm sure there are people like that. But because it's such a cultural orthodoxy, it's hard to get to ground level truth. And because there's so much that makes me question and so much dysfunction out there with an issue like this, it at least opens the door to me to questioning the whole enterprise and the foundational truths, around sexuality and practically speaking, how that plays out. Is that something we affirm? Is that something we celebrate? Is that something we promote? Or is that something we look at as something to be healed, something to be worked on, something that is indicative of deeper wounds? Not to cast shame and hate onto people, but perhaps this is somebody that needs support. And for many people, that is the case. I can't say for everybody. But so I can say that I think a lot of the intuitions and the values encoded, especially in something like Christianity, and I think a lot of traditional religious systems, I think are health-inducing, protective of health at a social and an individual level. Now there's shadow sides to it, and they can become overbearing and can get into very dangerous territory and hurt people. So of course, this is, in this world of duality, it seems there's always some kind of a shadow. But at scale and even in the individual's life, I see a lot of good with traditional values. Even if I can't 100%, I don't know what God's mind is in all this. I'm going to break this up into another video and hopefully get to talking about introversion, which was the whole point initially.